In waiting for us. It was quite the task to pull things together, and what we'd like to stress is, as a panel, that this is a preliminary statement which is to honor and respect the stuff that we heard, the voices that the witnesses, the prosecutors, the requesting organizations. So it isn't a judgment. When you think about it, it's a preliminary statement of what we heard that we as judges discussed. And before I start reading, I'd like to acknowledge and apologize. The question I asked yesterday was one of the, and things get lost in translation sometimes, and a witness who raised the issue of a seat at the table at the UN, and I now have a better understanding of what it is that she was requesting. And I think the absence of having Afghanistan at the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, etc., is a source of concern, and rightly so. And I do think that we need to acknowledge that although Afghanistan's chair is not occupied at the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, the Security Council, the General Assembly, and the Human Rights Council definitely have Afghanistan on the agenda. There's many resolutions, the special rapporteur's reports are considered by the Council and the General Assembly in New York, etc. So it isn't that Afghanistan, because they're not occupying the seat, that it's an issue that has been rendered invisible. So I just want to acknowledge and apologize if there was a misunderstanding on my part or in the way I understood the translation, because it was very clear that the concern was about a vacant chair of my country, at the UN, and it's a valid concern. So what we've decided to do is, as judges, we will read different sections, and I will start off with the context. The public hearings of the Permanent People's Tribunal for the session of the People's Tribunal for Women of Afghanistan was held in Madrid at the ICAM, located at Cala de Serrano. I don't speak Spanish, from October 8th to October 10th of 2025. The hearing followed the planned program, and there's a link, a hyperlink for the program if anyone wants to look at it. It is important to note that the accused parties, including individual Taliban leaders, the Taliban as a group, and the state of Afghanistan under the Taliban's de facto control, did not exercise their right to defense. And as you know, on both days I asked if there was representation in the room. The procedures outlined in the statute of the Permanent People's Tribunal for the proper and timely notification of the accused parties was observed. An official communication, including the text of the indictment and a formal invitation letter requesting the exercise of the right to defense in any form, was sent to the parties on the 6th of September of this year. On the 16th of September of this year, to the email address of the Human Rights Directorate at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Taliban, including the names of the accused persons, accused individual leaders of the Taliban. They were also offered assistance in the proceedings and we ensured a time slot in the program for an oral presentation. However, the PPT has not received any response from the parties. The president of the panel of the judges also made an announcement on both days requesting members of the defense to identify themselves if present in the hearings. However, no representatives, apologies to the interpreters. No representatives of the defense were present at the hearings. The period considered in this hearing includes more directly the facts, the jurisdiction, the actors, and responsibilities that have occurred from 2021, when the Taliban took full control of the country following the withdrawal of the international forces and the collapse of the then government. This statement that I'm reading out represents... Still a problem? Am I going too fast for the interpreters?
It's fine now.
Okay, thank you. So this statement that I'm reading out represents a preliminary statement of the panel of judges, which is composed by myself, Elisenda, May, Marina, Aranchana, Gizal, and Emilio and Kalpana. A formal verdict based on available factual evidence and on the basis of provisions of international law will be made available within the next 2 months. First of all, we wish to pay tribute to the courage of the women of Afghanistan and to express our gratitude, particularly to those who have shared their lived experiences with us. We thank the team of prosecutors, witnesses, and requesting organizations for the diligence and commitment with which they have assembled and presented an extraordinary wealth of evidence for this tribunal. So we do have a lot of work to do in the next 2 months with all the information we've received. The requesting organizations, Rawadari, Afghanistan Human Rights and Democracy Organization, the Organization for Policy Research and Development Studies, and Human Rights Defenders Plus, noted that they petitioned the tribunal to be held to illustrate the relentless pursuit for justice, dignity, and equal rights by the women of Afghanistan. These organizations hoped that the establishment of the tribunal would give survivors, which are the courageous women of Afghanistan, a day in court and also mobilize global public opinion. The organizations believe that the process of the tribunal can bear witness, can seek accountability, and challenge tyranny and its normalization. They also hope that this tribunal would enable the Afghan women to claim their right to be seen, to speak, and to demand justice in the face of the world's most extreme system of gender-based oppression. The requesting organization urged the tribunal to deliberate on the allegations of crimes and violations in Afghanistan, the generational impact of the current situation, and its implications for women's rights beyond Afghanistan. The organizations further stated that the context that brought them to the tribunal is the national system of persecution in Afghanistan. They came to us out of necessity and not by choice. Despite ongoing multiple efforts at the international level for accountability, including the International Criminal Court investigations in Afghanistan, a potential case at the International Court of Justice, the existing mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Afghanistan, the work of relevant UN treaty bodies, a campaign to codify gender apartheid, and a new independent investigative mechanism to collect and safeguard evidence for future prosecutions, the judgment of the tribunal is potentially an additional and immediate accountability tool in this toolbox. The prosecutors identified the Taliban not merely as the de facto governing authority, but as a perpetrator of a coordinated state-level campaign of gender persecution carried out with the intent to erase women from public life and to restructure Afghan society around male supremacy. The prosecutors further asserted that the Taliban's campaign is enforced through violence, coercion, and alleged religious justification based solely on the Taliban's leadership's perception of Islam and Sharia, which was further supported by the testimonies of witnesses that we heard. The panel of judges heard from prosecutors and witnesses that during the first Taliban rule and during the insurgency period, and since the return to power in 2021, the imposition of harsh gender restrictions reflects a pattern of violence against women, demonstrating the underpinning of a patriarchal ideology. The prosecutors noted that evidence from survivors, witnesses, and international bodies reveals a coordinated campaign to exclude, to silence, and to control women, banning their education, barring them from work, erasing them from public life, enforcing a strict dress code, restricting access to health, and punishing dissent with cruelty. They further asserted that these acts were not isolated, but were integral to the Taliban government's policies. Thank you, and I'll hand over to the next speaker.
I will now read a section that summarizes the law. The prosecutorial team argues that the Taliban's conduct toward the women and girls of Afghanistan since August 15, 2021, constitutes gender persecution as defined under Article 71H of the Rome Statute. Article 71H of the Rome Statute defines the crime against humanity of gender persecution as follows. For the purpose of this statute, crimes against humanity means any of the following acts when committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack. Section H specifically says, persecution against any identifiable group or collectivity on political, racial, national, ethnic, cultural, religious, gender, as defined in paragraph 3 or other grounds that are universally recognized as impermissible under international law in connection with any act referred to in this paragraph or any crime within the jurisdiction of the court. The prosecutorial team also argues that the Taliban's conduct toward the women and girls of Afghanistan since August 15, 2021, constitutes other inhumane acts under Article 71K of the Rome Statute. Article 71K of the Rome Statute references other inhumane acts of a similar character intentionally causing great suffering within the enumerated crimes against humanity. Additionally, the prosecutorial team argues that the Taliban's conduct toward the women and girls of Afghanistan since August 15, 2021, constitutes violations of numerous binding international human rights treaties to which Afghanistan is a state party. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICESCR, the Convention Against Discrimination in Education, CADE, the Convention on the Political Rights of Women, CPRW, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC, the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, Degrading Treatment or Punishment, also known as CAT, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CRPD. As affirmed by the UN Human Rights Committee, international treaty obligations remain binding upon successor authorities, regardless of political or regime changes. As a result, the Taliban, as the de facto governing entity in Afghanistan, is obligated to uphold these legal commitments.
Now is it working? Great.
Yes.
I will proceed to read the section on the tools and tactics used by the Taliban against Afghan women and girls. During the hearings, this tribunal heard testimonies of the most extreme system of oppression against Afghan women and girls. The Taliban have institutionalized the discrimination and repression of Afghan women and girls by issuing more than 100 binding edicts and decrees. The testimonies shared exemplify the reality of women oppressed not only through these decrees and bans, but also through the enforcement mechanisms that subjugate and control Afghan women and girls individually and collectively. These tools and tactics include death threats, such as being stoned and beheaded, sexual violence, and threats to family members. The Taliban dehumanize and stigmatize Afghan women and girls by using specific language that frequently includes labels such as prostitute and bad women. These edicts have banned Afghan women and girls from secondary education and universities, thereby denying women the right to be educated and pursue careers. By requiring Afghan women always to be accompanied by a close male member of the family, mahram, the Taliban has not only restricted their freedom of movement, but also their access to health facilities and doctors, obstetric and dental care, among others. Women testimonies also illustrate how discrimination affects them in different ways depending on whether they live in urban or rural areas. Since 2021, the Taliban have excluded women from almost all areas of work, banning and restricting Afghan women from working at government institutions, NGOs, and international organizations, among others. These measures have devastating economic and social consequences for Afghan people leaving men as the only breadwinners and denying women economic independence. Moreover, Afghan women's political participation has been banned, excluding women from their civil and political rights. Additionally, the Taliban are systematically targeting Afghan women activists by using surveillance systems and repressing those participating in protests. Afghan women are detained and abducted by the Taliban for protesting, not covering their body, going out without their mahram, and posting critical posts on social media. According to the witnesses, these are often arbitrary detentions in which women are subjected to torture, ill treatment, sexual violence while in custody, and forced confessions. Afghan women and girls are also object of extrajudicial killings and forced disappearances, suicide attacks, and stoned to death, putting at risk their right to life with human dignity.
Yeah, we also took note of some of the witness testimonies, and I'll read some of them. This is in quotes. "This is not just my story. This is the story of all women and girls in Afghanistan." Such were the words of one witness as she spoke to the tribunal, a sentiment that would be repeated numerous times throughout the 2 days of hearings. Indeed, as the tribunal listened to each of the witness testimonies, numerous recurring themes emerged. Witnesses described the Taliban's conduct towards the women and girls of Afghanistan since August 15, 2021, as repressive and worsening over time. When the Taliban targeted education, for example, they began by first denying women and girls a secondary and then a university education, and then further expanded the restrictions. "Education is the heartbeat of human rights," said the prosecution, as they detailed what these bans have meant in practice. They have meant economic exclusion, social dehumanization, structural violence, and an impact on bodily autonomy. Witnesses questioned why the pursuit of education was a crime and juxtaposed the Taliban's bans and restrictions on education with a Quranic commandment to read. As the Taliban set forth requirements that women be accompanied by a mahram to access health care, and as restrictions were placed on the ability of female health workers to work, witnesses narrated how this affected their access to health care. Here, witnesses highlighted the connection between the ban on education and the access to health. With women no longer allowed to study medicine, a shortage of doctors and first responders is likely to follow. As counseling centers have closed across the country, women who seek mental health interventions are also told to be, quote, patient, be patient and surrender to your destiny, as one of the witnesses said. Numerous witnesses expressed suicidal thoughts and described how self-harm had increased since the Taliban took de facto control. They also pointed out that women are suffering and dying from preventable diseases. In one example, a pregnant woman who was in labor was turned away from a hospital as she did not have a mahram present with her. Women with disabilities are isolated and confined to the home. The 2004 Constitution of Afghanistan had guaranteed constitutional protection for people with disabilities, offering them a pathway to access education and employment. The Taliban have since voided these provisions, leaving women and girls with disabilities facing compounded impacts. One witness described how she was targeted by the morality police for wearing a dress that did not drag on the floor so as not to interfere with her wheelchair. She also complained that traveling to see a doctor can be difficult, as taxis are often afraid to stop for women and girls with disabilities. Though the Taliban decree stipulates that a mahram is needed for journeys of more than 72 kilometers, the practice has been more restrictive. Witnesses described how public transport and taxi drivers often turn women away who are without a mahram, even in cases of emergency. One witness described how she was one of 7 sisters and only had her father to serve as mahram for all 7 of them, severely restricting their movement and confining them to the home as a result. Afghan women are repeatedly told, "Your place is in the home." Witnesses explained that they faced restrictions on their right to work. In addition, working for the government, civil society organizations, or international agencies has been entirely banned by the Taliban. One witness said, quote, "Before 2021, I had a job and could go outside. Now I have no job, can't go out. My spirit is broken. Everything in my life has multiplied by 0. God never said to confine people to their homes. Why do you put women in solitary confinement?" When women and girls took to the streets to peacefully protest the conduct of the Taliban, they were subjected to violent repression. This has included hitting women protesters with the backs of AK-47s, using pepper spray, and beating up those who were present to film these protests. Witnesses also described the closing space for women to appear in broadcast media and to participate in the media space more generally. The Taliban has used the excuses including security and public morals to repress women's expression and assembly. Often when women were detained, they were held in unofficial detention centers without a warrant, resulting in de facto enforced disappearance and incommunicado detention. In custody, they have experienced brutal beatings, torture, and have been interrogated until they agreed to forced confessions. Numerous witnesses described that most forced confessions involved admitting that they were misled by a Western influence. In other cases, male relatives of detained women were mistreated as a form of punishment or to establish a form of leverage over the women. Witnesses released from Taliban custody following such forced confessions or pressure on their families described how they viewed their apparent freedom. In quotations, "As a result, I was released from the prison cell of the Taliban, but I was confined to another prison cell, that of my home." Collectively, witnesses described the Taliban policies and actions as closing all doors to them. One of them said, "We are alive, but we are not living. We can barely breathe."
And now we briefly describe the impact of individuals, women, and society at large. By suppressing Afghan women and girls' rights to move around, express freely, and even to meet and give each other mutual support and plan collective action strategies to have access to education and health, the Taliban has reduced women's life options and women's freedom. Witnesses described the psychosocial impacts of these extreme violent situations and spoke about their feelings of isolation, profound sadness and pain that spans across generations, desperation about the lack of future and the loss of opportunities they had in the past. These are clearly reflected in the already mentioned increased suicide rates and self-harm attempts. Erasing the possibility of women protesting to defend their rights and limiting their social interactions is one of the most effective ways of eroding individual well-being and stripping the individual and collective feeling of autonomy and agency for women. And finally, my colleague will read the conclusions.
I'll be presenting the panel's concluding remarks for today. The panel of judges assures the women of Afghanistan that they have been heard. هیئت قضات به زنان افغانستان اطمینان می‌دهد که صدای آنان شنیده شد. د قاضیانو پلاوی د افغانستان ښځو ته داد ورکوي چې د دوی
The
غږ او
judges want to convey the message that the women of Afghanistan
Based on the
have been heard.
testimonies of the witnesses and the submissions of the requesting organizations and the prosecutors, the panel of judges will consider the following, among others. Assess the Taliban's conduct as crimes against humanity of gender persecution. Remind Afghanistan of its obligations under international human rights law. Support the codification of gender apartheid as a crime against humanity. Advance global jurisprudence on sex and gender persecution to address impunity and lack of accountability. Call for global accountability, restitution, and the restoration of human rights for all Afghan women and girls. Reiterate that normalization and engagement with the Taliban by the international community has severe implications for the rights of equality and non-discrimination of women and girls, not only in Afghanistan, but globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank our panel for the hard work that has gone on in the last 2.5 days, and thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to be part of this really important tribunal and the process going forward. Thank you.